Hello everybody and welcome back to another installment of the work diary where I show you guys the progress I made on my handcrafted Settlers of Catan board. Today I'm going to show you guys how I made casts for the bases on which I'm going to sculpt the rest of the tiles, and a few of the tryouts that I made on making forests and wheat fields for the actual board. The first thing I noticed while I was trying to sculpt on top of the das clay tiles that I made last time was that they were warping as they were drying, they were cracking, and they weren't curing to the exact measurements that I wanted. I wanted the finished bases to be roughly a millimeter short on each end so that they'd fit in the grid but not too tight so that they'd be easy to take out. So I wanted to solve that and make casts that were to the measurements that I needed. So the first thing I tried was using the silicon cast that I already made for the mountain to cast just the base. I did this by filling up the space for the mountain with some dust clay, leaving only the flat base be filled with plaster, and cast some plaster in to see what came out. The result was pretty nice, but there was a bit too much cleanup to do. Thinking back, which wouldn't have been that much of an issue, but it would only allow me to cast one base at a time. That would slow me down too much, and I needed a quicker fix. So what I wanted to try was creating a cast from foam core. To do this, I simply put the grid on top of the foam core and marked out and cut an exact space that would fit inside each grid, then glued that on top of a whole piece of foam core to create the mold, and of course weighing it down with something heavy to make sure that the cast was curing flat, and used that as my mold. Now, this worked very nicely, but I noticed that the foam core, when it was this small, was bending a bit, so I also had to weigh it down. Not that much of an issue. What would be a bigger issue when I tried this on a bigger scale. So what I did was I scaled up and tried to cast something like 8 hexes at a time, and this speeded up the process immeasurably. I could create a lot more tiles like this. The only issue was that to get the tiles out of the mold, I had to break the mold up each time, and this allowed me to use this cast only for 2-3 times before I had to cast it aside and put it in the garbage. That was enough for me to have enough bases for the dummies that I wanted and to have enough to experiment with. Here you can see my girls helping me out. They're casting their own plaster casts with the Hearst Arts mold and creating their own gaming boards. The only issue I had with these casts when they were done was that apparently I hadn't cut the foam core perfectly, so there was a bit of a roughage at the edges, but this was easily fixed with the box cutter knife and some sandpaper. I just checked these out, cleaned them up a bit, checked them against the grid, cleaned them up a bit more, and did that a few times so they fit exactly, but were easy to pop out of the grid when I needed. I had enough of these, and I left them to dry for another day or so that the plaster would be completely drying. So I let plaster air out for at least 24 hours before you do anything else with it, unless you want to shape it easily and carve anything into it, in which case you should work immediately after it's cast when it's a bit soft. But when the plaster was dry and didn't feel cold to the touch, I started building up my first dummy. And the first thing I tried was the wheat field, and I used the exact same technique I showed on the previous video, and if you want to look at that, I'm going to put a link on the top somewhere. Click on that and it'll send you immediately there, and then you can come back. If you've already watched that, so what I did was I copied the exact same technique and I built a nice wheat field on top. Looking back, I forgot to leave a space for the number, which I always do, and I did fix that at the end, and you'll see exactly how I did it. Another thing I added though to the wheat that I didn't show last time, because I didn't actually put it on a whole tile, what I did was I textured the dirt around the hay, roughing up some of it with a texture roller, but leaving some other parts smooth, only marking out lines of tilled earth to make it seem as if the field around the wheat was being prepared for another round of sowing, or had its wheat already harvested into the haystacks that you see to the side. When the wheat was done, it was time to make a little forest. What I did was I put some of the Sculpy backable glue on top of the tile, and then just added some Super Sculpy on top of the tile, creating these little hills and texturing them with a texture roller to make them a bit rough. Then it took some of the trees that I made previously and just planted them on top of the hills, making these small copses of trees, alternating the kind of trees, using some rounded ones, some cone-shaped ones, some bigger ones, smaller ones, just to keep it varied. I then added some of the stumps that I showed last time. You can see the technique in the previous video. Then I decided that this wasn't that clear that this was a lumber pile, so I added these small piles of timber that you see. Simply cut some sausages of Super Sculpy to the build, and then used my sculpting knife and steel brush that I made to scratch up the lumber and give it a bit of a wooden texture. Of course, forgetting to leave anywhere to put the number on, which would mean that I wasn't able to use this tile in the end, but it still came out pretty nicely after being baked. Once I baked everything, it was time to try out a paint scheme for each, and I used some Spring Green by Apple Barrel for the greenery around, just painting everything green, some Nutmeg Brown for the tilled earth around the wheat field, and some Pollen by Martha Stewart for the wheat itself. In the meantime, I'd like to say thank you everybody for watching, if you've been watching till now. I hope you guys found this video interesting. If you did, please push the like button and subscribe. Leave a comment down below. It really helps the channel grow and please the almighty algorithm of the YouTube. I try and put out a video every week and keep my content varied and interesting and helpful for you guys. So I'd really appreciate your help in making the channel grow, and I'd really appreciate your help in supporting this. And let's get on with it. For the woodland tile, what I did was I used the same spring green for the grass and some dark browns like the nutmeg for the stumps and the trees themselves, and then colored the treetops themselves in varied shades of green, from light green to dark green, and some oranges and reds, just to get a nice color variation for the forest. I then washed both tiles with a dark wash and went back over everything with lighter shades just to give everything a nice highlight. That was done, everything was nice and painted and washed in dark colors and touched up with a bit of highlights. I noticed that I forgot to leave areas for numbers on each of these. I tried to fix the wooden one, but popping out all the tiny stumps just ruined the entire tile and left too much markings on top of the tiles, and this one had to go. But I decided that I had to save the wheat field. To do this, I decided that I could just use another layer of Super Sculpy on top of the wheat field itself, but making it just thick enough to contain the number and not thicker, but also making it easily picked out of the indent. This will allow me to also layer the height of the wheat to the edges and make it seem as if one of the rows was planted later than the rest. Of course, retexturing everything with my steel brush. When I was done fixing the top layer of the wheat, I noticed that some of the thinner bits of Super Sculpy just around the edges of the tile hadn't really stuck to the tile and got raised a bit as they baked. To fix this, I used some DOS air dry clay, just put it on the edges to mask those raised a bit, and put some super glue underneath the parts that I couldn't fix and clamped them down. This came out actually very nice and made it so that you couldn't even see the imperfection. Of course, this is only a test tile, so I wasn't really too worried about it, but in the end, it came out pretty nicely. And that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and found it interesting. If you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one. Bye!